I'm a doctor now, and for that, I've spent 5 years in one of the most competitive, complex, and intense degrees. Despite somehow appearing effortless on the outside, the truth is far, far from it. In reality, my own medical records show my poor memory, poor attention span. I cannot stick to habits and have no routine. So to achieve my dream of becoming a doctor, I had to learn to adapt my distractible, easily bored brain to strategically approach what felt like impossible amounts of daily information. In this video, I'll share the techniques from my half-decade of experience, as well as neuroscience, psychology, and mathematical proofs I've picked up along the way, showing how anyone can better learn and memorize anything. Let's get straight into it. The first issue is that we focus on habits and techniques of study while completely ignoring how our motivation affects learning. Now, we can be excused for this, since almost all advice tells us to disregard motivation and use discipline to get things done because consistency is key. This isn't necessarily the case. If you've been smart or idiotic, laser-focused or scatterbrained, depending on how interesting you found a task, we're not alone. Intelligence tests can be influenced by our motivation to do them, and so can learning. It feels tasteless to say, but I recently wrote a paper for a 5-month module in 1 day, and it got an award. I wasn't consistent, I was motivated. For me, consistency has only guaranteed boredom or burnout. When I have motivation to study at my own random times, I perform a lot better. So if we know that we can get 10 times the work of a forcefully disciplined day done on a motivated day, but we don't know when motivated days will happen, how do we plan our studying? Well, luckily, there's whole multi-million-dollar industries in the business of understanding our focus and motivation. Yu Kai-to, a top gamification designer and the writer of this book, found that our motivation will fluctuate in a predictable pattern during the accomplishment of a long-term task, like learning. This pattern is captured in his Octalysis framework, which I've read and adapted. If we piggyback on the natural motivation waves, we can study when it's most likely that we want to, we can take time off when it's least likely to affect us negatively, and we can strategically approach information. So how would this work? Well, most courses have 2 main schedules: a teaching period when we try to study regularly, and an exam period when we stressfully cram. Using a motivation schedule, we can instead see the time during one course or one academic year or one's whole degree as divided instead into 4 main parts, each with their own natural motivation levels and ways to naturally increase them. First, we have the discovery stage. This is where we have just started a degree, a program, or a module. As there's novelty, unpredictability, and curiosity, our natural attention and motivation is high. It's best to use this motivation to explore the full scope of the specific course, to identify what is likely to be of interest and what is likely to be an issue for us. Here, we make sure that we explore how the course connects to our broader personal life and goals. We also create a human digest, which we'll touch upon more later. The second stage is the onboarding stage, which begins with the proper teaching of the course, the year, or the degree. In the UK, we don't usually take this period too seriously. For some degrees, the results of your first academic year don't even count, and I think this is horrible. During the onboarding stage, our natural motivation still remains relatively high because we're still discovering and we haven't yet gotten bored or properly discouraged. In a game, this is when we'd be learning the rules and the tools that we need to play. In studying, we use this natural motivation to exclusively learn the core basics of the subject. We don't make ourselves memorize or perfect anything here. We just need to know the essentials well enough to be able to keep up with information even if and when our attention tends to dip and we fall out of teaching later, which will then lead us to part 3, which is usually the longest and the more tiring stage. This is the scaffolding. Here, the grunt work happens. You have lecture after lecture, thousands of new concepts, words, and theories. This is where we are supposed to keep up with the regular, repeated actions of studying towards our goal. And this is also where the routine causes everyone's motivation to drop to its lowest level, and you are therefore the least likely to want to work. And this is where we now can benefit from what we've already set up. By having our interests already established during discovery, they are likely to keep our motivation from disappearing completely. The core basics that we learned during our onboarding means that we can still connect and understand what is going on, even if we drift in and out of work as we please. The main aim of this stage is not to be perfectly disciplined, which is exhausting, but to use our discipline enough to avoid demotivating level losses. These are the losses that actually make work harder in the future through causing massive emotional and mental setbacks. In my case, I never actually delayed sending in coursework or failed exams, although of course these are not fully in my control. And lastly, we go on to the end stage. This is where you have to complete the projects, you have to study for exams, send in your coursework, and this is the rush to the finish line. So it also has high natural motivation, but it has a different flavor. The form of panic attention might be here, which therefore might also involve anxiety. During the endgame, we are less likely to actually struggle to want to work, but we might still struggle with executing the work itself, which I'll touch on in a second. In the endgame, you complete what you skipped or skimmed during scaffolding. Here, we benefit from lots of natural spaced repetition. We have a pre-made framework from what to learn and revise, and we never need to start from scratch last minute. The reason I wrote a good paper during an endgame stage is because I had already spent months thinking, reading, and following my curiosity on the topic, even if I hadn't followed the set university schedule or even written down anything. Motivation doesn't solve everything. We can be highly motivated to study for an exam because we don't want to fail, but we might still somehow never actually work. I've had massive urgent to-do lists with things I know that I cannot avoid forever and that I know that I have to do and still have done no work all day. So how do we resolve this freeze procrastination? Well, we can switch from using free will to using distracted will. So let me explain. The popular advice for starting work is that we should do the hardest task first and get it out of the way, and that this will then make us want to continue with the more fun tasks. I'm sure it's popular for a reason, because it works for some people, but for me, it completely underestimates how much I can procrastinate. If I have to do unpleasant work, I will just never start working all day. Nothing is solved. When we're working on an unpleasant task, we either have a strong desire to not continue the task, experienced as suffering, or we have no desire to continue, experienced as boredom. To knowingly put and keep ourselves in those states, no matter how motivated we are to finish the task, we have to rely on using our free will, and I think this is unsustainable. But free will is not the only resource to do work. We can also have distracted or coerced will, also known as momentum. If we start with our first favorite task, no matter how easy, we're more likely to actually begin work instead of having a long pre-work procrastination period. We're also more likely to complete that fun task, which therefore adds to our sense of accomplishment and good mood. Completing fun, small tasks is also mathematically acting optimally, as it reduces the cognitive load of the number of tasks on our brain, another contributor to procrastination, and it reduces priority inversion, where a small, unimportant task eventually blocks a large important task. Because it stays in our attention or gets in our way, mustering up the will to continue with the less pleasant task or to do an unpleasant task instead of just that, and also the huge to-do list, makes work a lot easier. In general, I find harder things easier to do with momentum than with free will, which leads me to my next point. Momentum can and should carry on for a lot longer than we let it. If we actually mix and match tasks that we want to do and we don't want to do on working days, a 16-hour workday has been shown to be a lot more productive than 2 8-hour workdays because we have less cost switching. By replacing our daily study routine with genuinely long workdays, mean that we can get more done for the time that we put in, and we're likely to enjoy it a lot more. In university, I would pull the levers of what motivates me personally. For example, the importance of a task, unfortunately, does not really get me to study, but my interest does. And therefore, I optimize for increasing my interest and having long work days involving lots of things that I enjoy when I feel like it. Now, we're going to talk about absorbing information itself. And if there's one thing to blame here, it's our brain. Our brain can learn or neglect the exact same information depending on how and when it is presented. David Rell, a mathematician and physicist, wrote this book where he is fascinated by this and wrote extensively on how our brains are different to machines. Stay with me for a moment here. He says that it's very impressive how much of the universe and our body we understand, but in everything that we know, the specific nature of human intelligence is very much limited by our thinking. In mathematics, we have, for example, to use natural languages because our brain cannot cope with completely formalized mathematical language, even though that would be better in principle. We also have to present our knowledge in brief theorems because we can't stomach really long formulations. We can compare this, for example, with computers who love a stupidly long code but cannot use natural languages. The point here is, in order for us to have usable, understood, memorable concepts of something, we needed to somehow include all of the relevant information at once. We needed to be brief and we needed to be in as natural language as possible. We basically need a very, very solid summary. And this is where I ran into massive problems in university. I had 6 lectures a day, all on different topics, given by experts in each field. I had to jump in and out of so many different themes, all in unfamiliar languages, all too formalized, too long, too incomprehensible to someone who is not an expert. Without a solid, big picture of each, or what I call a human digest, I might as well be looking at zeros and one on a screen because the information will completely fly over my head. So, the main thing to do, if there's just one thing that will increase the chances of understanding a difficult topic, is to find or create an appropriate human digest, a full concept, inevitably flawed and limited in detail, of what we are talking about. The disease, the organ, the system, the function of what it is we're trying to learn. The benefit of doing this as early as possible in a subject cannot be understated. There's fascinating studies where participants were made to connect different discrete pieces of information to see what would facilitate or prevent new associations, therefore what would make learning easier or harder. It was found that if we create a new association with a piece of information that can only be recalled 10% of a time, so a new weak association, it will facilitate a second connection, so it would make more learning easier. If, however, this first bond is stronger and we can recall it 15 to 70% of the time, then it can have an inhibitory effect on a second bond. It makes further learning harder. The associations only become easier for further information after 70% is reached and beyond, which is when we've properly learned something. So, if we create this human digest, something short, lacking information, and small, to which we can add new information as we learn it every lecture, essentially every lecture, we're making it easier for ourselves both to be able to put what we're seeing in every new lesson into context by connecting it with our human digest, even though it's weekly, even though it's 10%. Therefore, it is made much more likely that the new information connects and promotes further learning, rather than just sitting nowhere in our head or not promoting memorizing altogether. It's very useful to start any learning by trying first to grasp everything all at once. If you made it this far, I have 2 requests for you, pretty please. The first is to let me know if you noticed and preferred a video like this where I have tried extremely hard for over a week to shorten and condense it as much as possible because I feel I ramble a lot in my videos and therefore maybe they're not as interesting or too much. So let me know if shorter was better in this case. And secondly, if you have been with me from the start of this channel and way back when in my medical school, this is a huge milestone and I really, really appreciate you for being here and bearing with me throughout the ups and downs of my university and this move now where I still don't have a proper house yet and things like that. So I appreciate you very, very much. And thank you so much for spending this time with me. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Be kind to yourself and others and do not believe everything you think. Thanks. Bye.